Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So today I am here to talk about the book Two Houses, Two Kingdoms, A History of France and England from 1100 to 1300 by Catherine Hanley. If you think you've heard me mention the name Catherine Hanley on my channel before, you would be right, and that is because I have been absolutely effusive in my love and my praise for her previous book, Matilda, Empress, Queen, Warrior. So when I found out that she had a new book coming out, I had to snap it up straight away. This book is very heavy and I don't know how long I'm going to be holding it up. Through this book, Catherine Hanley is tracking the relationship between the royal houses of France, known as the Capetians, and the English, known as the Angevins, also known as the Plantagenets, but Angevins is the naming convention that Catherine Hanley adopts in this book. The reason for picking the time period of 1100 to 1300 being primarily because a lot of attention is often given to the Norman conquest of 1066 and the 100 Years' War of 1337 to 1453 in terms of the relationship between the English and the French. This is the time period right in between those two events, which often doesn't get quite as much page coverage in terms of how it pertains to that relationship between the two royal houses. However, Catherine Hanley does note right from the get-go that the Norman conquest was really what launched the relationship between France and England. Previously, when it came to inter-country relations, England interacted mostly with the Scandinavian countries. It was primarily with the Vikings that they were most engaged with, whereas Viking engagement kind of dropped off after the Norman conquest. It didn't completely disappear, but it was nowhere near the scale that it had been for the better part of 300 years. But suddenly you have a Norman duke taking over the throne of England, being a king in one country and having lands that are tied up in another. An antagonism between these two countries is surely going to happen. I was really interested in reading this to kind of fill in a lot of gaps that I have about French history, especially because a lot of the books that I do tend to read are England focused, and they kind of treat France more as, you know, like a recurring annoyance, a country that just pops up every now and then to annoy the English, rather than it actually being an ongoing relationship between equals, between peers, and one that kind of ebbs and flows in terms of whether it is antagonistic or whether it's friendly. What I love about this book is that it isn't just like this happened, this happened, and this happened. Catherine Hanley really goes through great pains to be very person focused in this narrative and showing how personality often drove these events. There are moments where she shows great empathy for these monarchs, particularly ones who were quite young when they ascended to the throne, thinking about the kind of pressures that they would have been under, the amount of trauma that may have happened in their lives that really drove the policies that they ended up making. As I've said many times before in the past, I am very much a character focused reader, and whilst you may think that that only applies for fiction books, I think it definitely applies to non-fiction. It's why I do enjoy a good biography. And when we are focusing so much on the personalities of these monarchs, something that I came away from was just thinking about how petty these men are, and just the great effect of personal motivation and personal squabbling and bickering on inter-country policy. If you enjoy books and TV shows that are about like family drama, family politics, that are about manipulation and playing other people off against each other, I don't watch a whole lot of TV, but the first two shows that came to mind, very different shows, were House of the Dragon as well as Gossip Girl, but I'm sure that there are many other examples that you could point me to. Then this would definitely be a book for you. There is so much manipulation going on within the chapters of this book. One of my favourite figures, just in terms of the manipulation side of him, was actually Louis VII. Louis VII, who you might know as the first husband of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who, to be honest, I don't know, because I often saw him through the lens of Eleanor of Aquitaine, I never really saw him as much of a key player as he clearly was. I feel like he's often written as kind of the butt of a joke, that he was overly pious, that he kind of discarded Eleanor when she wouldn't provide him with sons, and then she goes and immediately marries Henry II and ends up having a billion sons. Sons upon sons. Through this, because we are looking at the relationship between England and France, you're seeing how dominant he was within that relationship for much longer than just his marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine and his discovery of her marriage to Henry II, and just seeing what a master manipulator he is, particularly playing off Henry II's sons against Henry II. I know, he's such a stirrer, and I just found it really funny. With this focus on personality, and particularly of pettiness between monarchs, it did draw out a lot of the time. I just got sick of seeing so much destruction happening for the sake of petty drama, particularly when she was talking about like sieges and pillaging villages. So much destruction happening just because of the whims of these men. And I feel like in other histories, you know, they might just kind of touch upon, oh, they raided a village, they pillaged a village here and there. But when you're actually thinking about what that means, it just leaves a bitter taste in your mouth. All this conflict, all this death, all this violence, and for what really? Not a criticism of this book, just something that it left me thinking about. However, because this is a long history, it is taking place over 200 years, Catherine Hanley is also able to showcase moments of peace between England and France. I think often the perspective people have is that it was a completely antagonistic relationship, and that was very much not the case, because of the fact that so much much of this policy was very personality driven. If two kings don't get on, then of course there's going to be a lot of conflict. But she particularly dwells upon the relationship between Henry III of England and Louis IX of France. And actually they had a pretty friendly, amicable relationship. We shouldn't just take it for granted that these two countries are always going to be at odds with each other. It is very much driven by the people at the top. Something that Catherine Hanley is really good at drawing out within this book is the role of women. Obviously these royal houses are headed up by kings, but that does not mean that women were by any means absent and not also affecting change. The struggle with drawing out the lives of medieval women, even of royal women, is that it's often just very poorly documented. But I thought Catherine Hanley did a really good job at drawing out information where she could. Wherever insight into what was happening with women was lacking, I could tell it was because the evidence just wasn't there for it, rather than Catherine Hanley not doing her due diligence and actually researching it and actually caring to look for that evidence. Which, to be perfectly honest with you, I expected, because this is the woman who wrote Matilda, Empress, Queen, Warrior. And not just for the role of women, but just generally for this time period. One of the things that I always think about Catherine Hanley is how fantastic she is at interrogating these sources, noting provenance, noting where particular writers might have some sort of bias to what they're saying. She particularly notes where writers may have gone back over their own work with the benefit of hindsight and changed what they originally wrote. I also feel like through this book, Catherine Hanley is really good at kind of taking a step back and is very good at explaining what she is talking about, rather than just assuming that her audience knows all of the terminology that she's using. In particular, her first chapter sets out a lot of her reasoning for certain terminology that she's using, but it's something that she carries through the rest of the book. Every now and then, just being like, okay, this is what's happening now. This is why it was happening. This is the cultural context, the religious context. So even though this is not a thing that we would recognize now, this is why this would have been very common practice in the medieval period. I don't know if I'm making any sense with that, but I just think she is very good at stepping back, zooming out and being like, hey, is everybody with me? In a way that doesn't feel patronizing and doesn't break up the flow of the narrative. Two Houses, Two Kingdoms actually ends with the marriage of Edward II of England and Isabella of France. The conclusion chapter where she talks about this being called Happily Ever After ... which, if you know your history, if you know about the relationship between Edward II of England and Isabella of France, you will know it's kind of doomed. Having that as the conclusion title was just a stroke of genius, and I was laughing so much when I saw it. There's this real sense as we get into the early 1300s that the future is looking bright, that the relationship between France and England has never been better, and I was just sat there like covering my eyes like, oh, this is all going to go terribly, terribly wrong. Not only is this relationship going to completely break down, but within a few decades we are going to be plunged into the 100 Years' War. And that final conclusion chapter was just dripping in irony, and it was so funny. Well played, Catherine Hanley. So there we go. Those are all of the thoughts that I had about Two Houses, Two Kingdoms. It was a really, really great read. I do think I slightly prefer Matilda, Empress, Queen, Warrior to Two Houses, Two Kingdoms, but I think that's purely because I do enjoy a biography. I do enjoy really delving into the life of one person, whereas obviously this is covering a much bigger amount of history. But it was a fantastic read and I really recommend it. Do let me know if you've read this, if you're interested in picking it up, or if you have any other recommendations for histories. I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.